facilitating the workshop on meaningful community engagement in health research priority set.
It shows the commitment to adhere strictly to fiscal measures as is a way to first tranche.
Yeah, Jeffrey, can you hear me? That was a bit muffled. Is that a yes?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. And you're happy for me to get started?
Yes, please go ahead. Just a quick FYI for those online participants. IT is still working out the breakout session, so you might still see a pop-up on your screen in case you want to join or move to a different parallel session eventually. So please, yeah, take note of that.
Yeah, apologies for that. Until IT can separate people into breakout rooms, you are going to be in this session. So hopefully you'll listen for as long as you're here and maybe stay on if you're interested in what I'm saying. So as I said, this session is on meaningful community engagement in health research priority setting. And I'm Bridget Pratt. I am an ethics researcher, and I'm joining you from Brisbane, Australia. I work in the Queensland Bioethics Centre, and that's at Australian Catholic University. And my co-facilitator today is Dr. Jeffrey Arheen, and he is in the room physically, and he's a research fellow at UMC Utrecht. So just to briefly introduce myself, I'm an ethics researcher, and I've probably spent about half my life in the United States and the other half in Australia. I did my undergrad in molecular biology in the US, and then I've done a master's in global health and a PhD in bioethics in Australia. After that, I did a Hecht Levy fellowship for 2 years at Johns Hopkins, Berman Institute of Bioethics, and Bloomberg School of Public Health. And then I moved back to Australia and was based at the University of Melbourne for a number of years before shifting up to Australian Catholic University. And now I'll hand over to my co-facilitator, Jeffrey, so he can introduce himself.
Well, yeah, I think I've been quite introduced already, but as you can see, my name is Jeffrey Kojo Ayin. I'm from the Netherlands in Rotterdam. I moved to Ghana several years ago, lived here for quite a long time, and a few years ago moved back to the Netherlands. I had a medical training in Cape Coast, and then my master's in Maastricht, and I currently work as a quality assurance specialist in a pharmaceutical company. The main things I see myself as a maternal newborn health quality of care advocate. That's what my focus has always been in terms of both research and implementation of interventions. Back to you, Bridget.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So today's workshop has two main objectives. The first is to introduce you to a toolkit that you can use to design research priority setting processes that more evenly share power with communities. And then the second part of the workshop is actually for you to practice using the toolkit. And so that will involve potentially small group work, but we might make it a wider group session depending on how many people are still here online with us. So I'm going to start by doing an introduction to the ethical toolkit for sharing power with communities in priority setting for health research projects. And I should give a full disclaimer. I was the lead developer of this toolkit, although I did work with a number of collaborators and research assistants to do so. And also, the toolkit is freely available online, so you can access it either through the QR code that is up on the screen, or through the website in green at the bottom of the screen. Meaningful engagement means sharing decision-making power with communities, not only in the priority setting phase of research, but throughout the entire research process for health research projects. Power sharing, of course, is a spectrum. So at one end, you have deep inclusion and meaningful engagement. And that means, communities are represented in their diversity in the priority setting process. And they're also able to raise their voices and be heard and actually influence the priority setting decisions that are made. At the other end of the spectrum is tokenism and shallow engagement, where communities are potentially not represented in their diversity, or they aren't actually given a voice in the priority setting process. They might be brought in, to rubber stamp some research agendas that have already been set by researchers or funders. Ethics, however, calls for engagement to fall on the more meaningful end of that power sharing spectrum. Social justice is a foundational moral value for health research, policy, and practice. And meaningful engagement furthers key dimensions of social justice. So social justice, firstly, means that those who are affected by a decision should be included in making that decision. So health research really affects the communities that it is conducted with. It determines, what medicines and what public health interventions they have access to, which can have a huge impact on whether or not people are actually able to maintain sufficient health throughout their lives. So it's really important that communities get included in decision-making around the health research that goes on with them. Social justice is also about reducing unfair power relations. Subordination is an unfair power relation where an elite and privileged few get to make decisions that affect the much larger majority who are not involved in decision-making. And so by engaging communities in health research priority setting, it can reduce relations of subordination, both between, academic researchers and the wider community, but then also in global health research, it can reduce unequal power relations between experts from high-income countries and populations within low and middle-income countries where a lot of the research is going on. Social justice is also about recognition, which means respecting and protecting difference and diversity. So it means respecting people as knowers and as people who have important information. And it also means making different types of knowledge visible. And so engaging communities in health research priority setting can both respect them as knowers, and it also is a way of accessing voices that have been historically marginalized or not really included in research priority setting. The problem, though, is that without attention to power, engagement can lead to presence without voice and voice without influence. And this is essentially what happens in tokenistic community engagement. And unfortunately, this isn't really a hypothetical concern. I would say in health research, a lot of the time, the engagement that goes on would fall towards the more tokenistic and shallow end. And also that community engagement and health research priority setting really doesn't happen very often. I think in a lot of health research, communities don't really have a voice in the research agenda that is being set and taken forward. So this raises the question, how can health research priority setting be designed to actually share power with communities and give them a real voice and seat at the table? And so the toolkit that I've developed, this is where it comes in. So the toolkit is a reflective project planning aid that is to be used before health research priority setting is undertaken. So it's really a toolkit for use when you're designing a research priority setting process. And by reflective, I mean that the toolkit includes a lot of different questions for research teams and their community partners to think about and answer collectively. And it's through that process of thinking about those questions and answering them together that it will help those using the toolkit design a better research priority setting process, one that more evenly shares power with the communities with whom the research is being done. And the toolkit itself, as I said earlier, I led its development, which took about 3 to 4 years and was a funded research fellowship for myself, but also included a number of other collaborators and research assistants. And its development involves conceptual research. So there are a lot of literatures like philosophy, development studies, health policy that look at the idea of meaningful engagement and participation and inclusion in a lot of detail. And so those concepts and ideas were canvassed and then applied to the health research priority setting context in conceptual work. And then I also conducted a lot of empirical work to then gather ideas from health researchers, community engagement practitioners, and people who have been engaged in health research about what sharing power and health research priority setting looks like. And then 2 case studies were undertaken on health research priority setting processes where people were engaged from the local community in the research priority setting process. And those case studies were in India and the Philippines. And that research really showed that there are 4 key steps to sharing power with communities in health research priority setting. And each of those steps has associated ethical considerations that are important to consider. And the toolkit itself consists of 4 worksheets that correspond to each of those steps. So selecting partners, deciding who to partner with, deciding to engage with the wider community, and designing the priority setting process. And each of those steps has questions within the worksheet, and those questions correspond to the relevant ethical considerations. So worksheet 1 helps research teams think about and collectively determine whether they can be strengthened by adding an academic or community partner. Worksheet 2 helps academic and community partners in a research team reflect on and collectively determine whether or not they can actually share power in their partnership and decide, whether they can actually have a meaningful partnership. If they decide that they can, worksheet 3 helps members reflect on and collectively determine whether wider community engagement is necessary in priority setting, and if so, whether it can be meaningfully done with members of the given community. Assuming that meaningful engagement with the wider community is actually possible and needed for research priority setting, worksheet 4 then helps a research team design the actual priority setting process for a given health research project. Reflecting on and collectively answering worksheet 4 questions will promote the design of priority setting processes where power is more evenly shared with communities, particularly those who are considered disadvantaged and marginalized within them. And the majority of the questions are primarily in worksheet 4. So the first step is really selecting partners. And this means for academic researchers, it's thinking about, which community organizations should we be partnering with? And for community organizations, it's thinking about, which academic researchers are going to be people that we want to work with. And I'm just in my talk now going to focus on two of the ethical considerations that arise when you're selecting partners, because these are relevant for the group work that we'll do in a little bit. So for academic researchers, an important ethical consideration is around what makes a good community partner, and is the community partner that I'm thinking of approaching someone who fits those features. Working with a community partner is a really good way that can facilitate meaningful engagement, but that is most likely to happen when you have community partners that have particular features, capacities, values, and networks. Only certain types of community partners are actually going to represent communities in their diversity and actually be able to access more disadvantaged and marginalized segments of communities. So from the research that I've done, features of a good community organization partner include, having leaders and staff and members from the diversity of the community. So they represent a broad spectrum of people from the community. They have decision-making processes that are participatory and that rely on deliberative norms. And they have strong networks within the community through grasswork and outreach, and that they have social justice and equity as guiding values. A lot of the time, if a community organization isn't particularly diverse, it will mean that the people that they can access and help researchers access to engage within the community will not be diverse. And potentially, if they don't really have very participatory decision-making processes, the priority setting process itself may potentially be less participatory and less able to share power. So it's really important to think about what features your community partner or the one you want to approach has, and whether or not it's actually going to be a good partner. And similarly, communities and community organizations need to think about, are particular researchers going to be good partners for them? Because when community organizations partner with academic researchers, it can help them do research that they need and that a community needs to be done. But again, this is only likely to be happening when the academic researchers have certain features, attitudes, and capacities and expertise. So features of a good academic partner include that they're actually embedded in the community, that they are service-minded people, they want to actually benefit the community, they are willing to share decision-making and go with community suggestions. They are also open to sharing personal information to develop deep relationships with their community partners. And they're open to listening and considering different opinions and to learning about each other. And they also recognize the value of community partners' capacities and expertise. So, assuming that you have identified a good community or academic partner, the next step is to really think about, how are you going to go to them and frame the priority setting process? How are you going to approach them and ask them to come and join you and to set a research agenda? And, ideally, power is most evenly shared when you can go in and frame the priority setting process as having an open scope. And so that means, that nothing is off the table. Any research topic, any research question, that can be on the table as part of the priority setting process. Unfortunately, there are usually constraints, funding constraints, for example, that make it quite difficult to, go into a community and basically say, we can do whatever research you need. Oftentimes, you'll come in with funding for a a specific disease, or you'll come in with the expertise to do research on a particular topic. And so in these cases, which I think happen more commonly just due to how the research environment is set up, then you need to frame your priority setting process slightly differently. You can't come in and say it's got an open scope. In fact, ethically, you really need to come in and be very transparent about what constraints actually exist. Because if you're not transparent, it has high potential to set up unrealistic expectations where a community thinks that you can come in and do whatever research they need. And when you don't do that, it can be very fraught and have very negative consequences. So it's important to think through, how you want to go in and frame the agenda setting process. And so one option is to come in and say that you will be able to do priority setting on a particular topic, but it aligns with the community organization's existing priorities. And another option is dual scope, which means that you come in and basically say that, yes, the priority setting processes focus is already set by the funder, but there's potential to build in the community partners agenda into the priorities that are actually set for research. And then a third option is capacity development. So you can say that the research priority setting and the research process will ultimately involve building partners' capacity to develop new capabilities, to identify research topics and questions, and to undertake research. So these are a couple of different ways that the priority setting process could be framed. So once partners have been selected, the next steps are really around, deciding, can we have a meaningful partnership together? If yes, then you start thinking about, can we meaningfully engage with the wider community that the community organization represents? And these two decisions really come down to whether certain foundations for meaningful engagement between the academic partner and the community partner, and then the overall research team and the community are in place. And worksheets 2 and 3 are really about helping research teams figure out the answers to those two questions. And with the research that I've done, it's identified 4 main types of foundations that are important to have in place if you're going to do meaningful engagement in research priority setting. And the ones in yellow are the ones that are most within the control of the actual research team. So these are the ones that the worksheets are actually raising questions about whether or not they are in place. And I'm not going to focus on those 2 worksheets anymore because the case studies that we're going to look at won't address those in the group work. And so finally, once it's been determined that meaningful engagement with the wider community is possible, the next step is then to finally design the research priority setting process in a way that ideally shares power with the community. And just briefly, if we think about meaningful engagement, it has 4 main components. Who initiates, for what purpose? So these 2 components reflect the fact that meaningful engagement means that the community is actually able to shape the decision-making space. They're able to be part of leadership of priority setting and to determine the purpose of priority setting. The bottom 2 components around who participates and how they participate reflect the fact that meaningful engagement is also determined by who is represented and whether or not they can raise their voice and be heard in decision making. So all four components are important to achieving meaningful engagement with communities in research priority setting. And each of these components has what I call associated sites of power. And so you can see there's a list of different sites. And just back on this slide, I've put the different sites underneath the components of engagement that they correspond to. And so these sites of power are really the aspects of research priority setting that affects, whether communities are able to lead and set the purpose of the priority setting process, whether they are going to be represented in their diversity, and whether they are going to actually be able to raise their voices and be heard in priority setting. And so each site has associated ethical considerations. And essentially what worksheet 4 does is it has a section for each site of power, and it asks 1 to maybe 3 questions for each site of power that raise the relevant ethical considerations. And in the last few minutes of my introduction to the toolkit, I'm going to focus on 2 of the sites of power that are relevant to the group work we'll do after I finish talking, empowerment and being heard. So empowerment goes back to the aspect of engagement around, what is the purpose of engagement? And the ethical considerations or questions in the toolkit around empowerment are essentially, will community partners be empowered as researchers during priority setting? And will community members' capacity to participate in research priority setting be strengthened? And the reason for having this consideration goes back to the fact that often engagement can have an instrumental purpose. So engagement is often seen or implemented as a means to a particular end, be that, increasing recruitment rates, getting input on ethics applications to identify risks of research for communities, or for making sure that research is responsive to the health needs of a given community. So these examples all think of engagement as a means to a particular end. It's not actually about empowering communities. Having an empowerment goal for an engagement process is something that happens less frequently. And so empowering community partners as researchers means building their knowledge and confidence and networks and capacities to actually undertake research, including priority setting, on their own. And empowering community members to participate in research priority setting means enhancing their knowledge and confidence and networks and capacities to participate in research priority setting processes. And these sorts of changes can ultimately lead to behavior changes that challenge unequal power relationships. For example, changes where community partners become able to identify their own research priorities can lead to shifts where they actually set their own research agendas and say, hey, if you want to do research with us, you have to follow these research priorities. And so where engagement in research priority setting only has instrumental purposes, this limits its capacity to actually reduce power disparities between academic researchers and the communities with whom they do research. Shifting now to the question around how communities participate in research priority setting. Being heard is another really important site of power. And the main ethical consideration or question that the toolkit raises in relation to this site of power is, will the voices of community members particularly those considered disadvantaged or marginalized, have equal or greater weight than other participants' voices when setting research priorities. And just to explain the importance of this consideration a bit more, I'm going to draw on two quotes from some of the research that I've done to develop the toolkit. So this quote is from a community engagement practitioner in the United Kingdom. And she says it's misleading, really, to just sort of listen and go, that's all great. And then afterwards go, well, we're not going to use any of what they said without saying that to the patient's face. I think that's really, it's misleading, it's disrespectful, and it undermines the whole idea of co-production. And then an ethics researcher who I interviewed, who is from Ghana, says it's essential that research teams are not involving them just to rubber stamp what you're planning. You're involving them by taking their views on board. So when they share ideas, you find a way of, incorporating those ideas into what you're planning so that they feel they have contributed to the process. So these are just some ideas around why actually using the ideas and the voices of community members in research agenda setting is important. And meaningful engagement, what that looks like is when the inputs of academic partners, community partners, and community members are all treated equally. And the views of community partners and members are taken on board, and you see a joint product. So the research agenda is actually created with inputs from academic partners and community partners and the community as a whole. And this can occur in two different contexts. So you can do research priority setting where the community is involved as a decision maker. So the people who are engaged from the community are actually decision makers in the research priority setting process. And this is where power is shared more evenly. The other context is where members of the community are involved as consultants. And this shares power less evenly because it essentially means that community members are going to give inputs, but researchers are the ones who are ultimately going to decide whose voices are used and listened to. And if consultation is how community members are engaged, then it is really important that researchers ensure that they actually use what people from the community have said should be the research agenda, and particularly take account of more disadvantaged and marginalized voices. They, of course, can't use everybody's voice. I'm not saying they should, but they need to be very transparent about whose voices they have used and why, and whose voices they have not used and why they have not used those voices if they're going to engage community members as consultants. So I hope that I've given you a good overview of the ethical toolkit. And we're now going to shift to the second objective of the workshop, which is to actually practice using the toolkit. And I'm going to hand over to Jeffrey to explain how we're going to do that. Although I can see that it seems like nobody has been split into another session. So we've still got a lot of people online. So we may end up doing a big group discussion rather than breaking into small groups, since I don't think we actually can break into groups. Jeffrey, over to you, although happy for you to ask me questions so we can figure out how best to work with how the IT stuff has panned out.
Yeah, sorry, Bridget, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, indeed. So today, what we ended up seeing is not what we expected, and we have about 50 or so people online versus a very few in person here. So we're gonna approach the workshop slightly different. What this workshop entails is that we have two case studies, and it relates to APEC Ghana and Sport Study Group considering adding a new community partner to their project to address mental health. For those in the room, we have the case studies here, so they'll be shared for you to read through and then bring your opinions on what should be considered and what should not be considered. And then for those online, I don't know, Bridget, if you still have the energy, maybe to take them through case one and see if we can get some respondents online about what they think should be considered as a good community partner. Would that be possible?
Yeah. So for those online, there is a Dropbox link that I popped into the chat before. I'll see if and I'm just going to do it again now. And so in that Dropbox, there should be a file for case study 1, which is what we will be discussing in our group. And yeah, so it's called Group 1 Case Study is the file. So I might just ask for people to click on the Dropbox link and then click on Group 1 Case Study and then take a few minutes to have a read, and then hopefully a few people or more will feel like discussing the 3 questions in the case study. So I'll just give people a few minutes to read the first case study. And Jeffrey, can you mute us in the room, or will you guys be kind of listening to us talk in the background? I think he's already muted
Yes,
us. Okay.
so I've asked the IT people to silence those of you online so you can have your own discussion whilst we have ours in the room here, and then we reconvene in 15 minutes. In 15 minutes to have a final group discussion, if that works.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. So people online, if you can please have a read of Group 1 case study, and then we can get started talking about the first question around what makes a good community partner. Does the new community partner fit these criteria or not, in a few minutes? Okay. I realize some people may still be reading, but I'd like to invite um, anyone who wants to start saying any comments in relation to question one to go ahead and unmute yourself. I'm happy for anyone to say something. I would prefer not to be the one talking. Just what do people think around whether the Mental Health for All Ghana makes a good community partner or not for the Spot Impact Consortium? Does anyone have any thoughts around that or how you might investigate further if you don't feel there is enough detail to make that determination?
Bridget, can you hear us again? I am muted. Oh. Hello, Bridget.
So if I get the question right, I think I'll go about framing the priority setting process with the dual scope method because in this case we have uh, funding specifically towards maternal or hypertensive staffs with mental health conditions. And these people are already into the mental health advocacy or research stuff. So once our funding is more geared towards a particular course, we use the dual scope so that we can also factor in what they are doing and then try and reach a common goal.
Hello, Bridget. Can you hear us?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you would
No.
work mental health in to kind of the preeclampsia research focus agenda. Is that you would frame it?
Yeah, please come again.
So you're saying you would frame it as that they can fit some mental health research questions, for example, within a broader research portfolio around maternal and child health. Is that what you're saying? Sorry, it's after midnight here, so I'm just a little bit tired, but trying to
Hello,
hear what
Bridget.
everybody is saying.
Hi, Bridget. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm saying something like that.
And do you have any examples, I guess, of how you might be able to incorporate mental health research questions within a preeclampsia agenda? I'm just curious. Neither is my area of expertise. Or if anyone else has any thoughts around how they might frame the priority setting process, they can also jump in.
Hello, Bridget. Can you hear us? No. Okay. And nothing is working. Yeah, that's there, but it's not responding.
Does anyone else have any thoughts about how they might frame the priority setting process? And which frame they might consider using, or you can also use multiple frames.
Hi, Joyce. Sorry, hi, Bridget. Can you hear us? Hi, Bridget. Can you hear us?
Yes, yes, I can.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, yes, yes, yes. Jeffrey, are you ready to bring the two groups back together?
Hi, Bridget. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, we were having audio issues here. We could hear you, but we couldn't speak to you. Um, Time is far spent, so I would rather want to ask you if you could sort of conclude. We had a nice discussion here, and I'm sure you had a nice discussion in your group as well. If you wouldn't mind um, rounding things up for us, and then we end the session here.
Yeah, sure. I just want to say thank you for everyone for listening and for participating. And again, the toolkit is freely available online via the QR code or the website. That actually, I might just finish up by sharing that. Yeah, so as I said, the toolkit is freely available via the QR code or the website on the screen. And yeah, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference, and I hope tomorrow is less rainy and it's easier to come in person. Thank you so much.
Hi, and for those online, I do know that there are quite a number who are also looking out for the presentation and resources from the other two parallel sessions, that of Dr. Sofrenyo and the other by Dr. Breche de Kok. The APEC Ghana team will make that available to all of you in due course, so then you'll be able to go through those presentations as well. So I hope with that, all concerns regarding having access to that one has been addressed.
Hello.
Yes, Nanama, go on.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether the link to the toolkit can be shared as well. Probably in the chat.
So yes, so Bridget just uploaded the link to the the toolkit. So if you go to the
Okay,
website, you'll find the companion kit there, the worksheets, and the worksheets as well. And they are freely accessible and downloadable from that website.
great. Thank you.
Then we thank you all for your participation. Bridget, thank you so much for staying up till I would assume is midnight now or 1 a.m. in Australia.
Uh, it's just after midnight. But as you know, my brain's jet lagged from an overseas trip, so it doesn't really know what time it is anyways.
Thank you all. Well, thank you so much for making the time for us. For the online participants, I believe you would stay online. There'll be a break that will follow after this, and then the next series of the next parallel sessions will commence. Hopefully, then breakout sessions will be made available for you to actually select and go to the specific parallel session you want to listen to. But yeah, thank you all for making the time to listen to Bridget, and have a nice day.